Hey everyone, rather Incoherent here. This is going to be a sort of a weird video for me. I'm going to be making a Rome Total War tier list. And the reason I don't like doing this right now is because I'm making this largely from memory and speculation and theory crafting rather than recent playing of the game. I think most people who have put forward Rome tier lists have done it under that same criteria, they're just not as forthcoming about it. Specifically, the reason I want to make this tier list is because I'm planning on uploading a playlist for every single campaign in Rome Total War Remastered, and I want to be able to look back and see how much my opinions change as I play the game. Now, before I start ranking the factions, I do have to explain the criteria my tier list uses. First of all, the tier list is meant for someone who's playing the game well and trying to play optimally. They know what they're doing. This is not a tier list for new players who are just learning the game. Second of all, this is a tier list for the campaign on very hard, long victory conditions. This is not a tier list for the versus battle mode in any capacity. The problem with this sort of tier list, though, is that Rome Total War is honestly not that hard of a game. Your win rate, even with the hardest factions, should be pretty close to 100%. So, what am I actually rating the factions on if you're kind of guaranteed to win if you play well? The way I'm rating the factions is going to be based on how effective they are at winning, how much room for error it feels like you have, and how much work it takes to get you to that victory screen. Now, the way I perceive power in Rome Total War's campaign is not very tied to unit quality. Unit quality matters. There's a consideration for unit quality when I rank these factions. But the problem is that the idea of late-game units is almost non-applicable to talking about the power of a faction. At the start of the campaign, there are around 10 minor cities on the map, no huge cities. And it's going to be a long time till you're growing cities in any meaningful way, so you just don't have that much access to late-game units. The marrying reforms won't happen until you hit a huge city, which again will be much later down the line. You will absolutely use some late-game units or the Marian reforms in your campaign, but the problem is, by the time those are a meaningful part of your army, you're already going to have finished the early game and set yourself up to win, even with the slowest factions. So, it's not the reason you won. You're absolutely going to use it, but it's not the reason you won at all. When I talk about unit quality for a faction, I'm explicitly talking about their early to mid-game units. The main thing I talk about when I'm ranking these factions is actually their geopolitical positioning. How wealthy is their land? How powerful and numerous are their enemies? Are they able to quickly expand into more wealthy land? Because less important than whether or not you have Histati or a phalanx or, I was going to say desert infantry, but having desert infantry is actually pretty important. Those are notably terrible. But less important than whether or not you have a 6 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 on the unit scale is how many doom sacks can you afford to fund at once? How strong is your economy? That's what drives you to victory in these games. So, something very important when I talk about geopolitical positioning is access to good land. There are 4 major breadbaskets in Rome Total War: the Italian Peninsula, the Southern Balkans, Asia Minor, and the Nile. There's some other land that's not bad, but isn't nearly as good, such as most of the Eastern Seleucid Empire, the Northern Balkans, the African coastline that Carthage inhabits. There's definitely areas of the map that aren't shit, but aren't those breadbaskets. However, there's also a lot of areas in the map that are downright terrible. Parthia and Scythia have awful starting land. Almost all of Western Europe is underdeveloped and underpopulated at the start of the game, and consequently terrible. And while I don't really consider world wonders to be an important factor in ranking these factions, it is worth noting that they also coincidentally happen to have all the world wonders on the east side of the map where these breadbaskets are. So, to quickly recap my criteria, this is for experienced players on the highest difficulty of the campaign, and while I care about the early and mid-game units, late-game units aren't really a factor in my decision-making. The big factor is how wealthy is your land, how wealthy is the land you're quickly expanding into, and how much of a threat from other factions do you have to deal with. I'm going to start off with the S tier and work my way down, and each tier to me has a specific meaning. S tier factions are factions that are actively hard to lose with. It's very difficult to imagine trying to win on an S-tier faction and somehow failing. It should come as no surprise, then, that all 3 Roman factions make it into S-tier. I've seen some tier lists that place Roman factions within different tiers. Specifically, it's usually the Julii getting placed 1 tier lower. But all 3 Roman factions have the same optimal strategy, where you bottleneck the other Roman factions to stop them from expanding, which steals very valuable land for yourself while kneecapping your eventual rivals. And then, once you have all 3 starting positions covered with your own land, it's always correct to expand east into the Balkans. It's the richest land with the most wonders. Europe sucks, Africa sucks after you conquer Carthage, which is what you did to bottleneck the Scipii. So, in terms of how you're playing the Roman factions, it's pretty much identical. The unit quality is pretty much identical. And these are factions with incredibly strong early infantry, limited early game enemies. They're positioned well to take over the African coastline, the Italian peninsula, the Balkans. They have no downsides and no weaknesses and are obvious S tier factions. Next up, I'm going to put the one severe outlier in this tier list into S tier, and that is Scythia. I just went on and on about how important land and economy is, and Scythia has literally the worst land in the game. I would say they're Numidia tier, but that would be an insult to Numidia, because at least Numidia has access to ports, and Carthage is nearby, which is a big city. Egypt is nearby, which is the Nile Delta, very valuable land. Scythia doesn't have any good nearby land to conquer. It is a genuinely terrible geographic position. What they do have is the best and cheapest horse archers in the game. Horse archers already being the most broken unit in the game. And their military is so ridiculously strong that, provided you build horse archers on the horse archery faction, I can't imagine you losing. There is one last faction that makes it into S tier, and that is Macedon. Macedon is, to my memory, a very average army. They've got good phalanxes, but their archers and their cavalry support for it are mediocre. They're a faction I remember getting buffed a lot in Rome Total Realism, and I might just be misremembering this, and their army could be better or worse than I'm thinking it is. The thing that Macedon definitely has, though, is a strong position in the Balkans to consolidate one of the breadbaskets under their control. And from there, they can expand either west and conquer the Italian peninsula, or east and conquer Asia Minor. Whichever they do, they'll probably do the other afterwards. Macedon is the faction most well poised to unite Italy in the early game, because the Romans can't. They just physically can't conquer the other Romans until they get popular enough with the people. Macedon is incredibly well positioned to conquer all three breadbaskets immediately, with the exception of the fourth one, the Nile, and that economic powerhouse driving them easily puts them into S tier. Moving on to A tier, this is going to be the list of factions that they're not hard to lose with, but they're easy to win with. And Egypt is sort of the poster child for this faction. You start off with all of the Nile under your control. Your only real enemy is the Seleucids, and the land you're conquering from them is decently valuable. You have incredibly good archers, and you have chariots at your disposal. The rest of your army is pretty meh, but it's good enough to suffice. The rest of the factions in A tier are factions that don't start off as well positioned as Egypt, but quickly solidify a position equivalently strong. Pontus is basically the Seleucid Empire without all of the problems. They have a similarly versatile army, an eastern starting position. Rather than starting off at war over a massive stretch of land, though, you start off tiny and are able to quickly consolidate Asia Minor, again, one of these valuable locations on the map, under your control. And once you've conquered Asia Minor as Pontus, you're in a very strong position to win the game. The Seleucids are not going to be a major threat to you. You're easily able from there to conquer the Balkans or the Seleucids and into Egypt and the Nile. Pontus is just very well positioned to win a game. They aren't the most impressive faction. They don't have a whole lot of bells and whistles making them stand out. But what they are is consistently very powerful. Armenia is secretly just Pontus in disguise. Armenia starts off northeast of Pontus, and rather than being a Hellenistic diverse faction, they're an eastern faction. Their units are substantially worse than Pontus's, with the exception of their disgusting cavalry. The big thing with Armenia, though, is that you just kill Pontus and then execute Pontus's game plan. It's the exact same faction, just with a different army composition. I do think its army composition is worse, and the fact that you're forced to start off in a serious war with Pontus instead of killing rebels does make them worse. Also, while Pontus just has to build a fort wall to their east to stop Armenia, Armenia has a much more difficult series of forts to construct to block off both Parthia and Scythia from actually attacking them. So defensively, Pontus is also much safer. These two factions, however, play very similarly and result in very similarly easy games. My last two A-tier factions are Thrace and Dacia, who are again largely the same faction, much like Pontus and Armenia. Thrace, in my opinion, has the better army and the better positioning, but these are meaningfully different factions in their geographic positioning. Thrace expands southeast, conquering Constantinople, and from there it's in a position to, like Pontus, take over Asia Minor, or go to war with the Macedonians and take over Macedon. Both of those are incredibly strong game plans. It doesn't really matter which one you take. The Bastarnae in particular stand out as really high-value heavy infantry. Generally speaking, Thrace's more Hellenic barbarian army is the best of the barbarian armies, excluding Scythia, which is just this weird outlier to the whole campaign. and Thrace is the best of the barbarian factions. Dacia, in my opinion, is slightly weaker in their military and geographic positioning. The big thing Dacia does is they expand southwest, consolidating all these rebels around the Adriatic coast, and then they sail across the Adriatic Sea and conquer Rome. They're actually, in my opinion, more well-positioned than any other barbarian faction to immediately conquer Rome. Thrace, of course, can just conquer Dacia and execute that game plan, and Dacia, likewise, could conquer Thrace and execute a Thracian game plan. So these two factions have very similar units, very similar game plans, and generally Thrace comes out slightly ahead. So if S-tier factions were our factions that are hard to lose with, and A-tier factions were the ones that are easy to win with, B-tier factions are going to be the ones that have a substantial problem. But once you overcome that problem, your victory is more or less assured. The poster child for this sort of gameplay are the Seleucid Empire and the Greek cities. Both of these factions start off overstretched and thin. You don't have the economy to support your army, you don't have the army to support your land, and you just have to figure out how to claw your way out of this position. Once you do, of course, you're basically secure in your victory. Securing yourself as the Greek cities would mean that you've secured yourself with a foothold in the Italian peninsula and the owner of the Balkans. So that's an incredibly hard position. The Seleucids are going to have longer wars with worse land, with the exception of conquering Egypt, but conquering Armenia, Pontus, and Parthia is just going to suck for you. It's just a thing you have to do. And also, defensively, are somehow even weaker than the Greek cities. Both of these factions have immense opening hurdles they need to deal with, but once they have, they're likely to win the game. In my opinion, and I haven't said this explicitly, I am ordering these by how I view them within the tier, but generally anyone within a tier is more or less the same power level. Next up are three more factions with a problem, but it's an offensive problem instead of a defensive problem. These three factions all have the same offensive problem, which is, how do I kill Rome? Because Carthage and Gaul are just very explicitly factions that are guns cocked and loaded at Rome's head. If you conquer Rome, you're set to win. If you don't conquer Rome, why do you even pick this faction? And honestly, these are factions where I feel more speculative, where I think, maybe conquering Rome isn't that hard, and these should be A-tier factions. Germania is actually just Gaul in disguise, the same way Dacia is Thrace in disguise, and Armenia is Pontus in disguise. Because as Germania, you just want to conquer Italy. Just plow straight through Gaul and then conquer Rome for them. Because like I said earlier, the land in Europe is just sort of trash. Conquering that instead of Italy is a massive mistake. Now, Parthia is the last B-tier faction. I think of all of the B-tier factions, Parthia has the worst starting position. It's just all the way on the edge of the map. But it is worth noting that Parthia does start with a minor city. One of the 10 or so minor cities in the start of the game is Parthian. It's Susa. And Parthia has horse archers. Somebody in another tier list I was reading said the phrase, "There's no such thing as a faction with horse archers that isn't at least in B tier." And I think I agree with that. I would actually be unsurprised to find out that after playing all these campaigns, I just create S tier as the horse archery tier and knock the Romans and Macedonians and everyone else down a tier and move Parthia up. But for now, I think Parthia is B tier on the strength of horse archers and on the fact that it's really not that hard to pick off the eastern edge of the Seleucid Empire. These are the least problematic in terms of their wars, but the most problematic in terms of their god-awful economy. These last three factions are ones where I feel bad saying that Britannia and Spain are terrible. Because C-tier factions aren't factions with an opening problem that you overcome and then you're set to win. C-tier factions just don't have strengths. You look at what Britannia and Spain are doing, unifying Britain, unifying Spain, and then conquering rebel settlements that are near them. It's just not that good. You're building up, you're consolidating, but you're a barbarian faction with undeveloped land. Building up for these factions looks worse than almost any other faction in the game. There's no immediately valuable land for you to go to the point where the optimal strategy for Spain might actually be to get everyone on boats and try to go conquer Rome at the start of the game. Britannia can't really do that because they're so much further away, it's so much slower. I don't know what good strategies look like for these factions. They seem to just have incredibly slow, weak starts. They start in land that, as any other faction, I have no intention of conquering. Of course, they're still better than Numidia, because D tier is better known by its street name, Numidia tier. Numidia is the only faction in the game that has this problem. You see, D tier is for a faction that, like B tier, faces a massive opening hurdle. But unlike B tier, after you finish that opening hurdle, you haven't won the game. You aren't set up to win the game. You're just able to start making plays that might someday win you the game. Once Numidia has conquered Carthage, They're just in Carthage's position with a few extra cities and probably a war with Egypt on top. It's not actually a better position, and their army is so terrible that I'd argue it's a worse position because you've given everyone time to build up while you fought with Carthage, and what you're making is worse than what Carthage could have been making. So, Numidia is just sadly and clearly the worst faction in the game. Like I said at the start of this though, this is all speculative based on memory and theory crafting and reading other people's tier lists. I'm pretty confident in this, I feel good about this tier list, but at the same time, I would be a fool to think that over the coming weeks and months I played 19 campaigns of Rome Total War, I'm not going to reevaluate this tier list. The other big reason I wanted to post this tier list was to create a comment section for people to discuss the tier list in, so that people could tell me how they think I might need to evolve my opinions on something, or maybe even wholly reevaluate something that I'm completely wrong about. In any case, this has been rather incoherent. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that YouTube algorithm jazz. I sincerely hope that you liked the video, and I'll see you around.